Widowed rancher took in a girl no one wanted. They found something neither expected. She was standing there like she'd been carved from silence. 19, barefoot, sun-worn dress, clinging to a frame that looked more bone than girl, more memory than flesh. No bonnet, no name spoken, just the way her mother tied the rope around her wrists, like it wasn't the first time. No one asked questions. No one stopped it. In that border town where justice cracked like dry earth, they called it legal. They called it custom. She was put up like livestock. No papers, no reserve, just her body and the absence of her voice. The crowd didn't blink. Some even smiled. She didn't cry not once. Because this wasn't new. It was just the first time it happened in public. Before we go further, welcome to Cracks of Light, a place where silence gets a voice and broken things find a name. If stories like these move you, stay with us. Hit subscribe, join the journey. We don't offer perfect endings here, just the kind that matter. They had nearly moved on when he stepped forward. Quiet boots. Worn duster. A man who didn't speak often and didn't need to. Elias. Folks knew him as the widower from out near the ridgeline. The one who sold off half his cattle after burying his wife and never looked anyone straight in the eye since. No one saw him arrive, but they saw him raise his hand. Just once, just enough. I'll take her, he said. Not loud. Not kind. Just flat and final. The crowd went still like the dust had paused midair. Her mother shrugged, slurred something about being done feeding a mouth that never paid her back, and pocketed the coins like it was beer money. Elias didn't flinch, he didn't bargain. He didn't untie her knot right away. Just met her eyes or tried to. She looked at the dirt. He looked at the rope. Then, with a slow flick of his knife, it fell. Still he didn't touch her. You hurt, he asked. She shook her head. You got a name? She didn't answer. Don't matter. He turned, pointed to a waiting wagon with a tired mule hitched in front. You can come, or you can stay. Your choice. That was the first thing anyone had given her in a long time. A choice, and somehow, she used it. She followed. The wagon creaked with every turn of the wheel, like even it wasn't sure it wanted to keep moving. Lena sat in the back, knees drawn up, fingers dug into the wood slats, not for balance, but for something solid. She didn't ask where they were headed. Elias didn't offer. There wasn't much to say. The road stretched behind them like something they'd both rather not look back on. The mule moved steady. Too slow for escape, too fast for regret. Elias sat up front, reins loose in his hands, shoulders square. He didn't glance over his shoulder. Didn't need to. He could feel her there. And she could feel him not watching. That was the difference. Most men stared alone. He didn't, he just drove. She watched the landscape roll past without really seeing it. Her mind didn't follow the trees or rocks or broken fence lines. It stayed locked somewhere else. On a post in a town square. On a rope that still itched around her wrist. On a voice that had stopped working long before today. Her body rode along. But everything inside her was braced for something worse. Because that's how it worked. Bad never ended, it just changed shape. The sun dropped slow, casting long shadows that crawled over the trail like hands reaching back. Every bump in the road rattled her bones, but she didn't complain. Not once. She hadn't spoken since he cut her loose. Not a thank you. Not a name Elias didn't push. He didn't fill the silence with soft words or hard ones. Just let it sit there between them, heavy but not sharp. Time passed, miles passed, still no words. And that somehow was the first thing that made her feel less afraid. Eventually, the road turned into something rougher, narrower. The mule hesitated once, then kept going. Lena gripped the edge tighter. Dust kicked up behind them, blurring where they'd come from. The town was gone now. No shouts, no coins changing hands. No eyes pretending not to see. Just wind and wheels. She let herself breathe a little deeper. It still hurt. When they finally stopped, she didn't realize at first. The wagon tilted slightly. Elias stepped down. The boards creaked as he walked to her side. She didn't look up. Didn't move. He didn't offer his hand. Just stood there waiting. When she did lift her head, she saw the house. Small, tilted some. Not broken, just tired. Like everything else. He didn't call it home. Didn't call it anything. Just said, you come in, or you don't. That's up to you, but if you stay, you don't owe me an answer. Then he turned and walked toward the door. She sat a while longer. Not because she didn't know what to do, but because it was the first time anyone had let her choose. She stepped down slowly. Her legs didn't quite trust the ground yet. The mule snorted once, flicked its ears. The door was still open. She followed, quiet, steps soft. Inside smelled of ash and wood and something like salt. There were no lace curtains. No fine china. Just what was needed and nothing more. He didn't speak. Didn't ask her to sit. Just nodded toward a pitcher on the table. If you're thirsty. She was. But she waited until he stepped into the next room before lifting it to her lips. Later, when he returned, he said, "Kitchen's there. Room upstairs on the left. You hungry?" She shook her head. He nodded. That was it. No questions. No offers she didn't trust. He climbed the stairs slow, like his leg hurt. She stayed in the chair. The silence in the house didn't feel dangerous. It just felt wide, like space she wasn't used to. That night, she didn't sleep much. Too many news sounds, floor creaks. Whined through old boards. A door that didn't close right. But no footsteps outside. No whispers. Just the quiet kind of alone. In the morning, she was already downstairs when he came into the kitchen. She had a mug in her hand, empty but held like it meant something. He blinked at her. "You don't have to do anything," he said. She didn't look at him. Just murmured, "I don't mind." They ate in silence. Bread. Eggs. Nothing special. But he didn't rush. Didn't fidget. Just chewed slow and steady, like it was the same meal he'd had 100 times before and would have 100 times again. She watched the way he moved. Measured. Careful, but not afraid. When she stood to wash the dishes, he didn't stop her. Didn't offer to help. Just said, "If the broom gives you trouble, it breaks easy. Been meaning to fix the handle." She nodded. Didn't touch it yet. That day, she swept the porch. The handle did break. She sat on the step with the two pieces in her lap, unsure what to do next. He came out a few minutes later with a pocket knife and a strip of leather. Said nothing. Fixed it sitting beside her, hands working like he'd done it 1,000 times. When he was done, he stood and walked back inside. That night, when the wind slammed the door, she flinched. He didn't pretend not to see. Just rose, checked the latch, and said, "Storm might roll in. Best keep the shutters tight." She nodded. Didn't say anything about the way her heart was pounding. He didn't ask. On the third day, she sat on the back steps, watching the grass. He came to stand beside her. Didn't speak. Just looked out where she was looking. After a while, she said, "Why'd you take me?" He didn't answer right away. Just scratched his jaw, looked at his boots. Because no one else did. She nodded like that made sense. Maybe it did. Maybe that was all the reason she needed. When she glanced at him, his face was turned toward the barn. She followed his gaze. Old boards. Rusted hinges. Nothing special. But it was standing. Later, as she lay in bed, she thought about that. About how something could look worn out and still stand. About how this house didn't ask her to explain herself. It didn't tell her to forget. It just didn't demand anything. That, more than kindness, was what shook her. She didn't trust kindness. Kindness always came with strings. But silence. Silence didn't lie. By the end of that week, she knew where the squeaky floorboard was. She knew which stair creaked loudest. She knew he fed the mule first every morning, then sat on the porch and rubbed his knee like it helped with the pain. She knew he spoke to the fence posts when he worked, like they were old friends who'd stuck with him. And she knew he hadn't once asked her where she came from. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood it wasn't time yet. She still hadn't told him her name. He still hadn't asked. But every night, when he passed her on the stairs, he said, "Good night." And every night, she didn't answer. Until one night, she did. Quiet. Barely above a whisper. But she said it back. "Good night." He didn't stop walking. Didn't turn. Just kept going. And she sat on her bed longer than usual, looking out the window, wondering why that small thing made her chest feel strange. Not heavy. Not light. Just different. Like maybe she wasn't waiting to be heard anymore. Like maybe the silence wasn't empty after all. The house didn't change all at once. It didn't soften overnight. But things began to shift, quiet things. There were crumbs on the table where none had been before. A half-washed mug left to dry near the sink. The broom, once propped in the corner like a forgotten limb, now leaned against the doorframe, its bristles bent from use. Lena didn't announce herself. She didn't say what she was doing or why. She just moved through the space like someone testing water with bare feet, unsure how deep it ran. Elias let her. He didn't offer chores or praise. He didn't comment on the clean plates, the folded towels, or the way the kitchen smelled faintly of bread by the third day. He just noticed. And that noticing was the beginning of something neither of them dared name. Every morning, she'd find a slip of paper beside the kettle. His handwriting was rough, like a man not used to letters, but it said enough. Coffee's hot. Tools in the barn if you need to move the crates. Or, rain might come. Shutters stick on the left side. Not orders. Not conversation. Just presence, written quiet. She didn't answer the notes, but she read them twice. Sometimes 3 times. She kept them folded in a tin on the windowsill. Didn't know why. He kept his space. Sat on the porch most evenings, staring out past the fence line like something waited out there only he could see. Sometimes she'd sweep past him, not speaking. Sometimes she'd sit on the bottom step after dinner, far enough not to intrude, close enough to hear his boots shift. On the 6th evening, he left his jacket slung over the rail. She waited an hour before touching it. Folded it neat. Didn't return it. Just placed it near the stairs. The next night, he did it again. Nothing was said. Lena didn't trust comfort. Comfort meant someone would take something soon. But Elias didn't take. He just existed nearby. He fed the mule before himself. Washed his own plate. Repaired the fence without asking for help. When she brought him a glass of water one afternoon, he nodded once and said, "Thank you." That word hit harder than most curses she'd known. She almost dropped the cup. She noticed things. The way he always knocked mud off his boots before stepping inside. How he never touched her. Not by accident, not by excuse. Not once. How he spoke to the mule more than to her. "Good girl," he'd murmur while checking the harness. "You're still stronger than most." She caught herself watching him sometimes. Not out of curiosity, out of caution, waiting for the slip. For the moment the mask came off. But there wasn't one. Either he had no mask, or he wore it too long to remove. Elias noticed things, too. How she flinched when thunder rolled in. How she never turned her back when washing dishes. How she always sat with her back to a wall. How she'd peel the crust off every slice of bread, eat only the middle. He didn't ask why. Didn't try to stop her. He just started leaving the crusts off altogether when he made breakfast. She spoke first on the 10th day. "That barn door," she said. Her voice rasped from disuse. "It's sagging." He looked up from sharpening a blade. "Yeah." She stood quiet for a moment. "I can fix it." He wiped the metal with a rag. "Need a new hinge. There's a box of them under the workbench." She nodded, turned, walked to the barn without another word. He didn't follow. But later, he checked. The door hung straight. Not perfect, but better. He said nothing. She didn't need him to. Night stayed quiet. She'd light a candle, read one of the old books she found stacked in a crate. Mostly farming ledgers, a few pages torn out. Once, she found a worn Bible with handwriting in the margins. She didn't touch that one. Not yet. Upstairs, the floor creaked the same way every time she walked it. Predictable. Like breathing. She left her door open some nights. Just a crack. Enough to hear the wind. Not enough for him to see in. Not that he ever tried. By the 2nd week, the silence between them didn't feel empty anymore. It carried weight. Purpose. When she passed him a bowl of stew, their fingers brushed. Neither pulled away too fast. When he brought in wood and set it beside the fireplace, she stacked it after he left the room. They moved around each other like old tools in the same box. Familiar, worn, functional. She didn't smile. But her eyes stopped darting so often. One night, she sat across from him at the table. He slid a tin toward her. Inside was thread. New. Bright red. She blinked. "Thought maybe you sew," he said. She looked at the tin, then at him. "I do." He nodded. That was the conversation. She stitched a patch for the towel he used to dry his hands. Left it folded on the railing. The next day, it was gone. No mention of it. But a second tin appeared 2 mornings later, this time with a thimble and needles. She didn't say thank you. He didn't ask her to. But she started humming when she worked. Not loud. Not cheerful. Just enough to let the air know she was there. The only door she didn't touch was the one at the end of the upstairs hall. Always shut. Once, she reached for it, but the knob didn't turn. Locked. She let go quick. That night, she asked, "What's in there?" Elias looked up from the hearth. Used to be her room. That was all. She didn't ask who. Didn't need to. His voice made the rest clear. As days stretched, she realized something that scared her more than hunger or pain. She was starting to expect him to be decent. Starting to believe he wouldn't turn cruel. And that, more than anything, was dangerous. Because she knew what happened when you let yourself believe you were safe. Still, she couldn't help it. When she laid out his cup in the morning, she poured coffee before he sat. When he returned from the fields limping harder than usual, she left salve by the basin. He used it. quietly, left the empty jar on the windowsill the next day. The air between them thickened, not with tension, but with something unnamed. It wasn't affection. Not yet. It was recognition. Of wounds. Of silence. Of survival. One morning, she stepped out to find him sitting on the porch with a second cup in hand. He held it out. She took it. Sat down 2 chairs away. They didn't speak. Didn't need to. The coffee was warm. The sky was pale. Their bodies shared the same stretch of space. For now, that was enough. They didn't plan on going to town. No one ever did when they didn't have to. But the salt was low, the flour was near gone, and the last spool of thread Lena had been using kept snapping near the seam. Elias hitched the mule early, didn't say much, just held the door long enough for her to step through if she wanted. She followed because that was what she did now, followed quietly, decided slowly. The wagon rolled steady, wheels chewing at the trail like always. He didn't speak. She didn't ask questions. They never rehearsed what to say if someone recognized her, probably because neither of them wanted to believe it might happen. But it did. They were halfway through the general store when it started. Not a shout. Not a scene. Just a whisper too close behind her ear. That her? The auction girl. The words weren't loud, but they stuck. First one glance. Then 2. Then a full turn of bodies. Lena kept her eyes down, fingers brushing the bolt of thread she needed. Just one small item. Just one thing she wanted without permission. But the woman behind the counter moved faster. Her hand came down across Lena's with a slap sharp enough to echo. "You don't touch that," she snapped. "This ain't a brothel pantry." The room held its breath. Elias was there before the silence finished falling. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't clench his fists. He didn't ask the woman to explain. Just looked down at Lena's hand, red blooming across the knuckles, then back up. "You speak to her again," he said, voice low, steady, calm in the worst kind of way. "You'll wish I raised my voice." The woman blinked, scoffed, but she stepped back. That was enough. Elias took the thread, set it back on the shelf, and walked out. Lena followed. Her hand trembled. Her chest burned. They didn't buy anything. Didn't say anything until the wagon was rolling again. Halfway home the tears came. She didn't want them to. Fought them hard. But they came anyway. She turned her face away from him, ashamed of the sound her breath made when it caught. He didn't speak. Just held the reins, watching the sky grow heavy ahead. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her dress. "I didn't even want the thread that much," she whispered. It wasn't about the thread. He said nothing, but his hands gripped the leather tighter. "You know what my mother used to tell me?" Her voice cracked. She said softness was a weakness, that the world doesn't spare girls who flinch. So she made sure I stopped flinching. She laughed hollow. "I was 15 when she first sold me to a man. Said I was old enough to earn my place." Elias's jaw tightened. Still, he didn't interrupt. She wasn't sure if she wanted him to. "When I tried to run, she locked me in a shed. No water. 3 days. I started counting men after that. Stopped after 6. Her voice was flat now. Not broken, just emptied out. Like she'd said it so many times in her head that the words lost all sharpness. "And I thought if I just stayed quiet enough, worked hard enough, maybe no one would want me bad enough to pay again." She shook her head. Didn't work. The wind picked up. The mule snorted. Thunder cracked once, far off but close enough to feel in her chest. Rain started falling like it meant to bury something. They didn't make it back to the house. The trail had gone soft. Elias pulled the wagon off to the side near the barn and called it. "We shelter here." Lena was out first, skirts soaked within seconds, feet heavy in the mud. She reached the barn door and threw it open. He stumbled in behind her, slipping once, catching himself against the frame. Inside, it was all shadows and the groan of old beams. Water poured in steady drops through cracks in the roof. They stood there panting soaked through. Her hair stuck to her neck. His shirt clung to the scars she hadn't seen before. "Why didn't you say anything to her sooner?" she asked. "Because I wanted to see if you would speak first." "Why?" "Because you never got to choose when to speak before. I wanted it to be yours." She swallowed hard. "You don't know me. I know enough." She turned away. "No, you don't." She took a breath, then another. "You bought me. Maybe you were nicer about it, but that's what you did." Elias didn't move. "No," he said finally. "I didn't buy you. I paid to end something. That's not how it works. It is if you say it is." The roof creaked above them. Then a crack. Then a sound like the world splitting. A beam fell from the loft. She shouted. He moved. Shoved her sideways. The beam hit him across the shoulder and dropped him to the ground. She scrambled to him, her hands already slick with mud and blood. Don't move. Don't move. I'm fine. You're not. She pressed her hands against the wound, trying to stop the flow. You're bleeding. It's not bad. It is. Her voice cracked. You're crying, he said softly. She hadn't noticed. I didn't want you to get hurt. I'd rather hurt than watch you get dragged back to hell. She choked back a sob. You said I could change the ending. I believe that. She leaned down, pressed her forehead to his. Then stay alive for it. He laughed. Weak, but real. That's a fine order. Morning came gray and quiet. The storm had passed. He sat propped against a barrel, arm wrapped tight in a cloth she'd torn from her skirt. She brought him coffee without asking. He took it without thanks. Their fingers touched. This time, neither pulled away. The barn was broken. The house still stood. So did they. Neither said what the night had done to them. But it had done something. The silence wasn't the same anymore. It had memory now. And maybe even mercy. The wound on Elias's shoulder had closed, but not without leaving its mark. He moved slower now, careful with the arm, but said nothing about the pain. Lena watched him favor it when lifting buckets, when tying off the gate, when reaching for a jar on the top shelf. He never asked for help. She never offered out loud, just made sure what he needed was already within reach. A week passed like that, quiet and practical, as if the storm and the blood and the falling beam had been just another chore on a long list of hard days. But something had shifted. In the way her hands lingered when passing him tools. In the way he looked at her a second longer before heading out to the field. It was subtle, steady, and terrifying. Lena felt it building. That ache in the chest that comes not from hurt, but from being seen too long without turning away. It wasn't fear, not like before. It was the fear of choice, of freedom. She had never had that before, not really. Every place she'd ever gone, someone had pointed where to walk, who to follow, what to be. And now, here, with no one pressing her, no one pulling strings, the silence felt too wide. So one morning, before breakfast, before the sun hit the porch rail, she said it. I need to leave. Elias didn't blink. Just set the kettle down and nodded once. All right. He didn't ask why, didn't question the timing. Just walked out to the barn and started hitching the mule. She stood at the door and watched him. Not because she expected him to stop her, but because she wanted to understand why he wasn't trying. But of course, that was the whole point. He'd never tried to hold her. Not once. Her bag wasn't full. A change of clothes, the spool of red thread, a small cloth-wrapped bundle of bread. On top, folded neatly, was the apron he'd patched after she tore it on a nail. She held it like it mattered more than it should have. He helped her into the wagon like always, one hand steady at the edge, then stepped back. The reins were in her hands now. She looked down at them like they were a test. The mule didn't move. She clicked her tongue once. Nothing. Pulled lightly. Still nothing. Elias stood off to the side, arms crossed. No smile, no smirk. Just waiting. She tried again. The mule blinked slow, shifted weight, but didn't budge. Why won't it go? She asked, frustrated now, more at herself than the animal. He looked up at her, calm. Because it was born here. And animals know when they're carrying someone who doesn't really want to leave. She stared at him, then at the reins, then at her own hands. Her chest tightened. It wasn't fear. Not anymore. It was something else. Something harder to name. She climbed down, slow, boots hitting the dirt with more weight than she expected. Her voice was low when she spoke. I don't know what this is. I just know it doesn't feel like running. Elias nodded. Then don't run. She swallowed. If I stay, what am I to you? He didn't rush the answer. Looked out toward the barn, then back at her. You're whatever you choose to be. You want to be my wife, you or you don't, you aren't, it's not my place to tell you. Her hands trembled. I've never had someone let me decide. He stepped closer, slow and even. That's all this is. A place you get to decide. Every day. She looked up at him then, and for the first time, the weight behind her eyes wasn't made of shame. It was something like wonder. She wasn't used to carrying it. What if I don't know how to be someone's wife? She asked. Then we figure it out, he said. Together. She stood there for a long beat, then nod almost imperceptibly, then I'm staying. They didn't speak of it again that day. No vows. No promises. Just a shared rhythm as they cleaned the porch, chopped wood, brought in water. But that night, she folded the patched apron and placed it in the drawer beside the stove. Like it belonged. like she did. The next evening, she came down for supper to find him standing outside with a small wooden box in his hands. He passed it to her without explanation. Inside were 3 nails, a strip of ribbon, and a folded slip of paper. She opened it. Build what you want. Hang it where you choose. Just don't ask for permission. She didn't cry. She just nodded and went back inside. The following morning, as the light crept into the kitchen, she found a needle tucked beside her coffee cup. New, sharp, waiting. She picked it up, held it between her fingers, and smiled, barely. But it was there. Real. Chosen. For the first time in her life, her name wasn't something that had been given. It was something she was about to define. And that more than anything was freedom. They didn't send word. Didn't fetch a preacher. No rings were bought. No white dress stitched. No cake baked. Just one morning, without asking, without planning, Elias walked out to the edge of the creek behind the house, and Lena followed. He didn't say it was a wedding. She didn't ask if it should be. They stood side by side in the same boots they wore to work, facing the water as it moved slow over stone, quiet like it had always been there. No words were written, no names spoken aloud, no promises made for anyone but themselves. The wind didn't pick up. The trees didn't sway. But something shifted between them all the same. Lena stared down at her hands. "I'm not clean," she said. "I'm not new." Her voice didn't shake. It just stated fact, the way someone tells the weather. Elias didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for either," he replied. "I'm only asking if you're ready to start from here." She nodded once. That was the vow. That was enough. They didn't kiss. Didn't hold each other close. Just stood there a little while longer, until the sun began to warm the back of their necks. Then they turned back toward the house, walked together without touching, but close enough to feel the weight of something new pressed between them. Later that night, she opened the satchel she'd kept under the bed since the first day. Inside it was a small folded handkerchief, faded blue, worn thin, edges fraying. It had once been her mother's, handed over not with love, but with a warning. Lena held it for a moment, remembered the voice that gave it. "This is the only thing worth anything about you. Don't lose it." She dropped it into the fire without a word. Watched the edge curl, then blacken, then disappear. Elias didn't ask. He saw the flames rise higher and said nothing. Just reached behind him and pulled out the wooden chair he'd been working on for the past 3 mornings. He set it beside the hearth and nudged it gently into place. She sat down in it. That, more than any ceremony, made it real. He took the chair beside hers. They didn't speak, didn't toast, didn't stare into each other's eyes. They just watched the fire settle, the coals pulse, the ash gather. It was the kind of quiet people long for without realizing it. Nothing expected, nothing owed. The next morning, the air held something different. Lena woke early and laid the quilt flat with careful hands. She moved through the kitchen like someone who knew where things belonged, not by habit, but by choice. The coffee was already made. A folded cloth waited beside her cup. Not fancy, just a stitched square with a single red thread sewn down one side. She pressed her fingers to it and let them linger. When Elias came in, boots muddy, shirt wrinkled from the barn, he didn't say anything about the cloth. Just poured his coffee and sat across from her. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the kind they used to share. This one had roots. By midday, they were working side by side in the barn. He hammered. She held board steady. Her braid was loose, and she didn't fix it. His shirt sleeve caught on a nail, and she reached over to unhook it without thinking. He didn't flinch, just kept working. That evening, she washed her hands at the basin and turned to find him placing a box on the windowsill. Inside was a folded piece of paper, 2 rusted keys, and a ribbon the same shade of red she'd stitched the night before. She didn't ask what they were for. She just nodded. That night, she brought the keys upstairs and slid them into the drawer beside the bed. She didn't sleep much. Kept the window open, listened to the crickets. Elias didn't come upstairs. But before she closed her eyes, she walked over and nudged the bedroom door open halfway. Not all the way. Not locked. Just open enough. In the dark, that felt like the loudest thing she'd ever done. In the following days, nothing grand changed. No neighbors arrived to bless the union. No letters came in the mail. But the house shifted in small, stubborn ways. The kitchen window stayed cracked to let in the smell of the trees. A second coffee cup always sat waiting. Her boots no longer lined up by the door. They rested at an angle, beside his. She took down the yellowed lace curtain in the front room and hung a plain cloth she'd sewn from feed sack scraps. It wasn't pretty, but it was hers. One afternoon, she found him sanding a length of wood behind the barn. She didn't ask what for. He didn't say. 2 days later, a small bench appeared at the edge of the porch. He left his book on it. She added a cushion. Neither of them claimed it. But they sat there most evenings, saying little, watching the sky change without needing it to mean anything more. The town never sent a note. No church bell rang. But the land knew. The mule walked slower when they left, faster when they returned. The chickens wandered closer. The wind quieted when it passed the porch rail. And Lena walked with her chin up. Not proud, not healed, but here, present, chosen. One night, she turned to Elias as they sat beside the fire. "This isn't what most would call a wedding," she said. He looked at her. No, there was no altar, no dress, no preacher, no need. She paused. "But it still feels like a beginning." He nodded. "That's all it needs to be." She reached out and touched his hand. Not soft, not hesitant, just firm, like someone planting something deep. He turned his palm to meet hers. Their fingers laced. The room didn't feel empty anymore. The silence, like the fire, held warmth. Not bright, but enough. And that, for both of them, was more than either had ever been given before. By the time spring crept back across the ridge, the house had changed. Not in structure, though the roof no longer leaked, and the fence stood straighter, but in feel. Things held longer now. Warmth, time, silence. Lena moved through each day not like someone waiting to be asked, but like someone who already belonged. She planted greens near the back stoop, carved rows in the dirt with steady hands, pressed seeds in with her thumbs. She stitched when it rained, mended socks, patched sleeves, cut old shirts into strips, and turned them into new things. She taught Elias letters at night, one page at a time, her voice calm, his fingers slow over every curve of a word. He didn't ask to learn. He just showed up beside her when the lamp was lit, shoulders squared like he was fixing a fence instead of himself. He never got frustrated. She never pushed. He worked on the roof during the clear days, stripped old boards, hammered new ones in place, grunted through the pain in his arm without drawing attention to it. She handed him nails without being asked, caught the hammer when it slid off the edge once, never mentioned how his hand trembled before reaching for it again. They didn't talk much during work. They didn't need to. There was a rhythm now, something unspoken but dependable, like a trail worn by boots that had walked it long enough to know where not to step. One afternoon, while she hung linens across the rail, a woman walked up the path. Lena recognized her immediately. The storekeeper's cousin, the one who'd once watched her with narrowed eyes and pursed lips, like something unclean had wandered in off the dirt road. The woman stopped a few paces back, held a jar of preserves in one hand and a bundle of fabric in the other. Her voice didn't shake, but it didn't hold its usual steel either. "My niece," she said, "is being christened next month. I was wondering if you might sew something. A dress. Nothing fancy, just..." Her words trailed off. Lena wiped her hands on her apron, didn't smile, didn't soften, just nodded once and said, "I'd be honored." Not "I can." Not "I'll try." Just that. "I'd be honored." And with that sentence, something old and heavy dropped behind her like a rusted chain hitting the floor. Later, she told Elias about it, handed him the jar without looking up. "She didn't apologize," she said. "Didn't need to," he replied. "She came to you." That night, she worked by lamplight, tracing patterns onto muslin, careful with the curves, sharper with the seams. She hummed a tune she didn't remember learning. He sat nearby, flipping through a primer book, mouthing words he hadn't known how to say before she arrived. When she looked up, he didn't glance away. That was new. And she didn't flinch. The next few weeks moved in small, quiet ways. She cooked without measuring, and he ate without complaint. They shared the porch most evenings, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with silence. When the fence buckled again near the far pasture, she helped carry new posts out. He didn't slow his pace for her. She didn't ask him to. When her fingers blistered from the weight of the hammer, she wrapped them in cloth and kept going. One morning, a young boy from a neighboring farm came by with a letter for Elias and a question for her. "You're the lady who sews, right?" She nodded. "Mama said maybe you could teach me how to patch trousers. She's tired of doing it for me." Lena didn't hesitate. "Tell her I'll come by Thursday." The boy grinned and took off. She stood at the doorway a moment after, the sunlight catching the edge of her sleeve, and for the first time, didn't feel like someone who used to be anything. Just someone who was. The word wife started showing up on the edges of conversation. Not spoken loudly. Not worn like a badge. Just there, present in the way people nodded to her when passing the house. In the way Elias started saying, "we," when talking about the barn or the roof or the fence that needed new nails. She didn't correct him. She didn't have to. She found herself smiling more, not wide, not constant, but real. She'd reach for the pan before he asked, refill his cup without thinking. He fixed her sewing stool when one leg started to wobble. Never said it. Just left it sturdier the next day. They moved in loops now, kitchen, porch, barn, field, and every path circled back to each other. She wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore. She wasn't holding her breath. This wasn't safety because danger had passed. It was safety because trust had arrived. Trust in a man who never once asked her to explain. Trust in a home that never locked its doors. Trust in herself to be more than the worst thing she'd survived. When the christening dress was done, she wrapped it in linen and walked it over herself. The woman who'd asked for it answered the door, eyes going wide at the detail, the handwork, the care. "I didn't know you could do all that," she said. Lena met her gaze level. "There's a lot people never ask to know." That night, she pulled out the tin where she'd once kept Elias's notes. Slipped inside, it was a new scrap of paper. No message this time. Just one word, written in his rough, familiar scrawl. Lena. Nothing else. No question. No request. Just her name, set down like it mattered. And it did. Elias took down the old photograph without ceremony. No sigh, no glance back. Just lifted it from the nail above the fireplace and placed it gently in a drawer that didn't lock. In its place, he hung a small square of cloth, stitched by hand, thread pulled careful, two names side by side, Elias and Lena. Underneath, in letters not fancy but steady, one word sat quiet, enough. No one else needed to understand it. It wasn't for them. It wasn't about death or forgetting. It was about a space made, claimed, filled. It was about putting down what hurt and choosing what healed. Lena didn't ask when he'd planned to do it. She just stood beside him that evening, holding the edge of his sleeve like it might explain the ache in her chest better than words ever could. He let her hold it. That was all. The next morning, she walked out onto the porch barefoot. Not by mistake, not in a rush, but because the ground felt different now. It didn't carry weight. It held her. She touched the frame of the door, the same one she'd been afraid to walk through months ago, the same one she now passed a dozen times a day without thinking. But this time she stopped, stood still, listened, and knew there was nothing coming for her anymore. No footsteps behind her. No debt she hadn't paid. No name she didn't earn. She had been the girl with no voice, no say, no place. Now she was the woman who cooked meals without asking how many, who stitched names into cloth because she believed in them, who poured coffee for a man who read slow but steady and never once looked at her like she was a thing to pity or possess. She had become someone you couldn't buy, someone who stayed because she said yes, not because she didn't know how to say no. That was the difference, that was the story. And maybe you've never been tied to a post or sold by blood. But maybe you've been looked through, talked over, made small. Maybe you've been quiet so long it started to feel like safety. And maybe, just maybe, you're wondering if it's too late to step into something else. It's not. The name they gave you isn't the name you have to keep. The story they started doesn't have to be how it ends. You get to choose. You always did. Even if no one ever told you. Thank you for being here, for staying with us all the way through. If this story moved you, if you saw a part of yourself in Lena or Elias or the silence between them, help us keep sharing these kinds of stories. Leave a comment, tell us what it made you feel, and don't forget to subscribe to Cracks of Light, where the quiet voices still get heard and broken things don't get thrown away. They get named.